Okay, in this video, I'm not really going to do anything apart from make excuses, I guess, because I reached a point in which I said we've got pretty much everything covered and we can try this out. And I said apart from the obvious, and the obvious being, if we've changed duration, will that have affected start of injection? And of course, that's the $65 million question. Will we have affected start of injection? And if we have, will it have made very much difference? And of course, tied in with all of that is, if we've got more fuel being injected, will we have adequate pressure to actually make sure that we can get the injection done in the time we're claiming the duration map will do it? And obviously that all again ties back to start of injection, because depending on when we start, that will determine when we end based on how long the duration is. So they're all linked together. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to mention rail pressure. I've just made a few notes here, so there are no pictures to look at. I'm just reminding myself, because there is not much point in my going over rail pressure other than to show you the obvious, which is that if I go and look at rail pressure, if we search down here for rail pressure maps, that could well be the absolute total system maximum, more or less set by the manufacturer. That could be the maximum at any particular point, and then this could be values that the system is going to be using while it runs. If you want to change these values, it's very difficult to know what you should change them to and how much difference that's going to make. The obvious difference is that if you make them too high, what you're going to do is damage the pump or damage the injectors or cause some problems. So what you don't want to do is raise the values too high. So if we just pick one of these at random, you can see that if we wanted to make changes, we would have to look and say to ourselves, well, where would we make changes? Well, obviously the changes would be at the bigger end. They'd be right up here. It's possible at the moment that because of this, we haven't got the right values on here, and so we might want to make changes. But it's equally possible that the rail pressure can just extrapolate quite easily, because we're only going from 65 to roughly 75, and so it's quite possible that the ECU will happily just say to itself, oh, these are really big numbers, I'll just use those big numbers. And you can see why, because they are pretty much all the same numbers, not always, but fairly often they're fairly near the same number once you reach a point. So whether that was 65 or 70 or 75, these numbers would be very, very similar. Maybe not identical, but they would certainly be similar, and they've reached a peak there anyway. So what I'm saying is, generally speaking, I would not change any of these maps, not straight away. So that's why I said we're pretty much ready to try, because I would not change these maps. And if I did decide that it was worth changing them just to see if there was a difference, well, first of all, obviously the only change I would make would be the axis. I would change this axis so that it read up to 75 instead. So I just change the figures on here like on any other axes we've changed, and these would end up reading up to 75 instead of 65. But as I say, I'm not sure that's going to make that much difference to this particular file. The only other thing I would do is consider raising in this sort of area here these values a little bit. But what you don't want to do is go over what is probably the maximum anyway. So you need to go and look at some of the other maps. The value that's the maximum is almost certainly this one, the 18000000, God knows how many million zeros. So you're not going to want to go over that anyway. So these you'll be raising possibly a small amount in this area, but the maximum ones you won't be raising at all. And the ones you are raising, just use a calculator. You can just say to yourself, well, I'll raise them 1% and see what happens, or I'll raise them 2% and see what happens. don't go over something like, say, 3%. You may not even be able to go over that much, because very quickly you may find that these numbers are getting very close to that number. So there will not be a lot of leeway to change these numbers. Some people treat this as like the sort of a holy grail, but it's ridiculous, because if you just start pushing up all the numbers in the pump and the system, all you're doing is encouraging failure of the components earlier. So that there is not a lot to gain, unless you're going to have huge performance from the car and then get rid of it before it breaks completely. But basically, if you just want a reasonable tune, you may not need to touch that at all. So that's why, although there's not a lot to see in this, because there is not really a lot to do. And the same thing applies to start of injection, except for the fact that start of injection is a nightmare because of not knowing what start of injection you're ever looking at. So in other words, if we go back here, as I've said earlier in earlier videos, what I've got here are apparently bunches of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 maps. So apparently I've got bunches of 6 maps, and if I open one of these, what I've got then is a similar problem that we saw on the rail pressure. In other words, if I make a change to any of these, where would I make the change and what would I do? And again, not very much is the simple answer. Probably the ECU will cope quite happily with these numbers not matching. So in other words, although I might be asking for 75, there's a fair chance the ECU won't just give up when it gets to 65. It will work out what sorts of values are okay for 75 and carry on happily. If it doesn't, and of course it's possible it doesn't, but if it doesn't, then you could change these. And when you change these, you're basically just changing them and leaving these numbers more or less as they are. If you decide to change the actual main numbers, only change them by very small amounts. So again, maybe change them by 1 or 2% and see if that makes a difference. And this is where rolling road is handy. You only need to change them in the area where you were making tune changes before anyway, so we're only looking at this little area, and you're only talking about changes of 1 or 2 degrees. So don't think to yourself, well, I'll change it by 10 degrees and then see what happens. Or maybe say 10% and see what happens, and then change it by another 10% and see what happens. That would be ridiculous. You might want to change this by, say, 2% and see if the car feels any different, and then perhaps change it by 4% and so on. So you might want to change these by small amounts. And again, a rule of thumb is that you can work your way towards, say, 10%, but you probably can't or don't need to go anywhere further than that. And what you will probably notice, if you do this carefully, is that as you advance the start of injection a little bit more for your tune map, you will reach a point at which the car does feel better, and that might be just a small amount of advance, and then after that it'll either have no effect or it will even get worse. So you can find a spot fairly easily that's much better, but of course you do need to keep going back to exactly the same road, same conditions, same gear, etc. all the time, or have access to a rolling road. But, and I've said this before, the big problem isn't really that. The big problem is what maps do you change, because if you decide to change these maps, if you only do changes to this one and this one, they would be the warm maps, so that would make perfect sense. So perhaps only change those two, and then of course find the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and maybe only change 5 and 6 there. The problem you will have all the way along is not being 100% sure which maps you are actually changing, unless you've got a Damos that will tell you exactly which maps you are changing. And of course, I did hint at it before, but once you get to things that are going to look vaguely like the first of the post injection or the second of the post injection, you don't really want to start changing those at all. So you don't need to worry about changing those at all. So they can just be completely and utterly ignored. In other words, leave them alone. And in fact, in terms of tuning, very often the simplest way of dealing with one aspect of post injection, of course, is to delete the diesel particulate filter. Now, this is illegal in many countries, so I can't exactly advise people to say this is what you should do. But obviously, if you delete the diesel particulate filter, the regeneration part of injection stops. So you will get an increase in fuel economy straight away, but you will be polluting the environment. So that is a problem. But you will also be chucking out a lot of maps that will just sit there and not be used anymore. And that will include some other maps that you might have changed. So in other words, quite often you find that some of the maps here are different versions of main injection and pilot injection that take into account the fact that regeneration is or isn't running. So by deleting the function of the diesel particulate filter, you can have a knock-on effect of stopping lots of other maps working that you now don't need. The advantage of that is that it's quite difficult to work out what maps you don't need and take the maps out yourself. So if you can do that via a diesel particulate filter switch, it means you've got a whole load of bits and pieces that you don't have to consider. But of course, if you don't know which ones they are, it doesn't matter, because you'd have to change them anyway, wouldn't you? Because if you don't know that that map, let's say, is diesel particulate filter, but this one down here isn't, because you don't know which is which, you've got to change them both anyway. So you can't win in that sense. Right, I just round this off by reminding people that these videos don't tell you how to tune. In other words, I'm not saying do this, do that, get 5% performance, do this, do that, get an extra 20% performance. The whole point of making these videos is to show you the sorts of changes that you could make, hopefully without doing any harm to your car or a customer's car. And so you can then edge your way towards arriving at maps that you feel comfortable with and you feel confident with. So if the same car turns up again, you'll be able to more or less copy maps from a map you've done previously into the new ECU file, and you know that you've got a sound, good map. So in other words, you would be then building up a little stock of maps that you know are good for particular conditions. And in many respects, that's much better than just buying in a map. So it's got a lot of advantages. Okay, I'll stop there.